Up until now, we've been talking extensively about how the Federal Reserve System is going to use those three monetary policies: the buying and selling of government securities, the change in the discount rate, and the change in the required reserve ratio in order to impact the monetary supply, either to contract or expand the monetary supply, which is going to go on to contract or expand the whole entire economy, how that affects the aggregate demand, and then the investment expenditures and things of that nature, and how it affects the macro economy. Well, they're not the only ones with these kind of tools. Matter of fact, the federal government as a whole has tools that will work to expand and contract the economy as well. And it begins actually with their extensive federal budget and expenditures. So let's dive into what those are. So let's begin with the annual federal budget. What is the annual federal budget? Well, it's an annual budget set forth by the government or by the president, and it's the president's spending and revenue plans for the upcoming year. So it's what the president believes that the federal government is going to spend and how much they're going to make in that particular year. This budget is what we consider dead on arrival, since it's actually used as a starting point for future negotiations. It's very rarely, if ever, actually just accepted as is. Actually, it's typically used as a starting point for those negotiations of, all right, where do we go from here? And the reason that it's often just a starting point for negotiations is that it's often considered optimistic, or it has an optimistic assumptions of the underlying revenue projections for the federal government. So often it's considered it takes on a lot of optimistic assumptions of how much the federal government is going to make through their revenue, which in turn is often considered your taxes. The amount of taxes that we pay in this plan often considers those taxes to be higher than what they really are, kind of an optimistic assumption of those taxes. So that's the federal budget. Well, what is the federal expenditures? Well, the federal expenditures is the total spending by the federal government. Now, this number has grown drastically since World War II. So here's a couple of numbers at you. These are nominal values. In 1950, the federal government spent $42.4 billion. Quite a bit of money back in 1950. By 2014, then the amount of the nominal value that was spent was $4 trillion. The federal government spent $4 trillion in spending in 2014. And guys, that was the nominal value. So let's go ahead and adjust this $4 trillion in 2014 to the real value. So that way we can compare the real value of 2014 back to the value in 1950. So the real value of 2014 was about 70% of the nominal value. That was $2.8 trillion. So if we're going to compare the real value of 2014 then back to 1950, we spent $42.4 billion in 1950 and $2.8 trillion in 2014. So our governmental spending, our governmental expenditures, the federal expenditures are actually going up. So real capital spending has more than doubled between 1970 and 2014. So the federal government is spending a lot more in these federal expenditures. So let's look at the breakdown of actually where is all this federal money going? Where are all these federal expenditures going? Well, Social Security benefits, they take up the largest chunk at 24.26% in 2014. National defense accounts for about 17.21%. Medicare is sitting right around 14.65%. Income security programs sitting at about 14.65%. So let's ask where agriculture is, because we're dealing with agricultural economics. Where does agriculture fit into this governmental spending? Agriculture accounts for less than 1% of the total federal expenditures here in the United States. Well, let's compare that to 1987, when it was 2.6%. So as a percentage-wise, we used to spend a lot more on in agriculture, or the federal government used to spend a lot more in federal expenditures on agriculture as a percent of the total budget than what they do now. Because now we're at less than 1%, as you could, and especially as you can compare it to these upper, higher value aspects. So now, how much of the United States governmental spending, federal expenditures, or governmental spending accounts for the U.S. GDP? Actually, U.S. GDP 18.29% of US GDP is from government spending. So the government actually accounts for almost 1/5 of total spending here in the United States of the final products, final goods and services. Almost 1/5 of it is actually bought by the federal government. So 18.29% of US GDP comes from this federal spending. Well, how does that compare to other countries? Sweden's federal spending accounts for about 60% of their GDP. The Netherlands accounts for about 55% of GDP. The UK accounts for 45%, and Germany accounts for 43%. So we're not as high as some of these, especially some of these European countries, but we still account for, or the federal spending almost accounts for about 1/5 of the total US GDP. Why is that so significant, ladies and gentlemen? It means that the federal government spends a lot of money, and part of the aggregate demand is accounted for with that federal spending. So if the federal spending starts to go up, well, the aggregate demand is going to go up. So that's going to be kind of a segue with where we're going of how the federal government can actually influence the macroeconomy.